Each exchange shapes the final verdict. Every camera uncovers reality, grasping your legal protections, enforcing true justice.
Picture this. You arrest a black woman alone at a gas station. She tells you, calmly and clearly, that she is a federal magistrate judge. You look at her credentials bearing the seal of the United States District Court, and you laugh. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncertain one. A dismissive, contemptuous laugh, the kind that has been practiced over years of never being questioned. You book her anyway. You put her in a holding cell while her mother is dying in an ICU 4 miles away. You high-five your partner in the parking lot. Then, less than 12 hours later, you walk into a courtroom for your own civil rights trial. And she is the one wearing the robe. That is not a metaphor. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what Deputies Harlan and Klein did to the Honorable Ada Campbell, federal magistrate judge for the Western District of Texas. And what those two men could not have known, could not have calculated in any version of their arrogance, was that Ada had just spent the worst night of her life saying goodbye to her mother. If you are ready to see what happens when institutional racism collides with the one person in the room who knows exactly how to dismantle it from the bench, like this video right now. And if this is your first time here, subscribe before this chapter ends, because tomorrow's story is one you will not want to miss. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Now, let's go back to the Shell station at exit 245 on Interstate 35 and watch two deputies make the worst decision of their careers. The fluorescent lights above Pump 5 were the kind that made everything look like evidence. It was 3 a.m. The air along Interstate 35 north of Austin carried the particular chill of a February night that had not decided yet whether it wanted to become something worse. Ada Campbell stood beside her black sedan, a credit card still in her hand, her fingers tight around its edge. She had been inside the hospital for 11 hours. She had held her mother's hand through 2 medication adjustments, a breathing scare, and a long, terrible silence that the night shift nurse had filled with soft reassurances that no one in the room believed. She had told herself she was just stopping for gas. 10 minutes. She would be home in 20. The patrol cruiser came in from the south access road with its headlights cutting across the pump canopy before the lights went on. No siren. Just the bar of red and blue rotating in the dark like a slow announcement. Ada did not move. She had been stopped before. She knew the geometry of these moments, the way time slowed, the way her body had learned, against her will and over decades, to become very still. Deputy Harlan stepped out first. He was not hurrying. That was the detail that would stay with her long after everything else had resolved itself into memory, the unhurried quality of his walk, the flashlight leveled at her face before he had covered half the distance between them, as though she had already been categorized and the only remaining task was processing. She raised one hand to shield her eyes. With the other, she held her credentials forward. She stated her name and her title clearly: Federal Magistrate Judge, Western District of Texas. The identification in her hand bore the seal of the United States District Court. She had been issued it 23 years ago and had never once needed to use it to protect herself from the people sworn to protect the public until that morning. Harlan took the credentials. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has already decided to disbelieve. Then he laughed one short, flat syllable of contempt and handed them back to her without lowering the flashlight. His partner arrived from the north end of the lot within 90 seconds. Deputy Klein pulled in at an angle that blocked Ada's vehicle entirely, his own light bar joining Harlan's in a canopy of blue and red that turned the gas station into something that looked, from the outside, like a crime scene. The charge, Harlan cited, was suspicious activity. A description that had been called in earlier in the evening, vague, unverifiable, and bearing no documented connection to Ada Campbell, her vehicle, her route, or her presence at a gas station 4 miles from a hospital where her mother was dying. The handcuffs closed on her wrists against the warm hood of her car. She noted the temperature of the metal. She noted the pressure point at the base of each thumb. She noted the smell of gasoline and cold concrete, and the distant sound of a truck engine idling at the far end of the lot. She noted these things the way she had trained herself to note every detail in a courtroom, not because the details were comfortable, but because precision was the only form of dignity available to her in that moment. Across the street, a Whataburger employee stepped out the side entrance and raised a phone. A trucker at Pump 7 did the same. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The recording had already begun. Ada recited the Fourth Amendment under her breath in the back seat of the patrol car. Not as protest, not as performance, as anchor. as the thing she had clung to in every courtroom where someone powerful had tried to convince her that the law bent around certain people rather than applying to all of them equally. She had spent 23 years insisting, from the bench, that it did not bend. She was not going to let it bend here, in the dark, in the back of a cruiser, on the way to a detention center. At booking, the night shift officer paused at her judicial credentials. His expression shifted a brief, recognizable flicker of institutional alarm. The look of someone who suddenly understands that a significant error is being made and has not yet calculated whether he has the authority to stop it. Harlan overruled him with seniority and tone. The fingerprinting proceeded under lights that reduced everything in the room to its worst version of itself. She sat on a concrete bench in a holding cell for 3 hours. The fluorescent hum above her never varied. There was no clock. She tracked time by the pattern of footsteps in the corridor and the distant sound of a radio at the booking desk cycling through the same 4 songs. At 5:23 in the morning, a door opened, and Captain Ramirez, a man she had never met, who introduced himself with the careful formality of someone managing a situation he had inherited rather than created, told her that her credentials had been verified through the federal court database and that she was being released. The bond was issued on her signature. Her vehicle had been towed to a lot on the south side of the access road. She paid the retrieval fee with the same credit card she had been holding at Pump 5 when the cruiser pulled in. The pressure lines on her wrists had already begun to bruise. She drove north on Interstate 35 towards Cedar Park, 20 miles of familiar highway she had driven hundreds of times. In weather and in grief and in the particular exhaustion that follows a long courtroom session. The sky to the east had not yet decided to become morning. Her phone, charging on the console, had accumulated 47 notifications while she was inside, then 60. Then, by the time she reached her exit, more than she could count. The videos were already there, shot from 3 different angles, at 3 different distances, by 3 people who had no particular reason to be recording, except that they had seen something that the oldest part of their civic instinct recognized as wrong. The hashtags were already moving. The views were already climbing, not in hundreds, but in hundreds of thousands, feeding up towards something that could not be undone. She did not watch them. Not yet. She unlocked her front door, sat on the edge of her bed, in the clothes she had put on 18 hours earlier, the faded law school sweatshirt that still held the antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor, mixed now with something harder and colder, and allowed herself 10 seconds. She counted them. 10 seconds to feel the full weight of everything, the rage, the humiliation, the grief for her mother still waiting for her in an ICU room she had not been allowed to return to. Then she straightened her spine. Somewhere on the internet, a video was moving faster than either she or the deputies understood, and somewhere across town, 2 men in dress uniforms were sleeping without any idea what they had set in motion. The phone began vibrating at 7:47 in the morning. Ada had been asleep for less than 2 hours. She registered the first call as something peripheral, a disturbance at the edge of an exhaustion so total it had the texture of sediment. The second call pulled her closer to the surface. By the third, she was sitting upright, the sweatshirt still on her body, the bruises on her wrists a dull confirmation that nothing from the night before had been a dream. The number on the screen belonged to the Travis County District Court. She answered. The voice on the other end was measured and direct, the voice of Chief Judge Elena Torres, a woman Ada had appeared before twice in her career and respected for exactly the quality she was hearing now. The ability to deliver complicated information without burying it in apology. The overnight footage of Ada's arrest had reached millions of viewers by 6 in the morning. The plaintiff's attorney in an ongoing federal civil rights case, a Section 1983 excessive force claim, filed by a 19-year-old named Jamal Reed against deputies Harlan and Klein, had filed an emergency motion at 4:45 in the morning citing unavoidable structural conflict. The presiding judge had recused before dawn to protect the integrity of the proceeding. Ada's name had come to the top of the rotation by seniority and by the specificity of her civil rights litigation background. The trial was calendared to begin in 90 minutes. Ada sat with the phone against her ear and said nothing for a long moment. Her mind was already moving through the recusal analysis 28 United States Code Section 455, the standard for mandatory and discretionary disqualification, Fifth Circuit precedent on personal knowledge versus personal interest, the distinction between a judge who has been wronged and a judge who cannot be impartial. These were not abstractions. She had written bench memoranda on this precise question. She knew where the line was. She also knew something Torres had not said aloud. The emergency motion had been filed because the deputies' own footage had gone viral. Their own recording of their own conduct had created the conflict that had cleared the docket and placed their victim at the head of it. They had built the mechanism that now pointed directly at them. She told Torres she would call back in 10 minutes. She opened the emailed case file on her phone. 247 pages. Jamal Reed, 19 years old, a sophomore at Morehouse College, home for the weekend. Pulled over on Interstate 35 northbound at 11:14 in the evening for an alleged lane violation that the dashboard camera footage included in the plaintiff's exhibits directly contradicted. What followed the stop was documented in medical records, forensic photographs, and the testimony of two witnesses who had watched from a nearby parking lot. A knee applied to the back of a young man who was not resisting. Gravel pressed into the side of his face, a fractured orbital bone that had healed at an angle that would be visible for the rest of his life. The criminal charges filed against Jamal Reed had been dropped 6 weeks later without explanation. The medical bills remained. The nightmares remained. The slight asymmetry in his face remained. Ada was 30 pages into the file when the second call came. It was the hospital. Her mother had passed at 1:17 the previous afternoon, peacefully, in the company of two nurses who had stayed past the end of their shift. One of them had played hymns from a small speaker on the windowsill. Evelyn Campbell, age 71, former elementary school teacher, church choir director, the woman who had worked 2 jobs to send her daughter to law school, had left the world gently with music while her daughter was being fingerprinted in a room with no windows. Ada set the phone down. She allowed herself 5 minutes. She had given herself 10 the night before, but grief, she had learned, did not negotiate. It arrived on its own schedule and left the same way. She sat with it fully, the loss of the woman whose hand she had held through everything, the weight of promises made at a hospital bedside, the particular cruelty of having been taken away from that bedside in handcuffs. She let herself feel all of it. Then she washed her face with cold water. Twice. She called Torres back and confirmed she would take the bench. The recusal motion, she knew, would be filed before opening statements. She had already composed the oral ruling in her mind. Full disclosure of the prior night's events on the record, acknowledgement of personal knowledge, citation of the Fifth Circuit standard distinguishing knowledge from bias, and a statement of the principle she had enforced from the bench for 23 years, that a judge's personal experience of constitutional violation does not disqualify her from upholding the Constitution. It makes her better equipped to do so. She dressed in the dark of her bedroom with the deliberate economy of someone who has made decisions in difficult conditions before. Black robe. The strand of pearls her mother had given her at her swearing-in ceremony, still in the small velvet pouch in the top drawer of her dresser, worn exactly twice since then, once on the day she was appointed, once on the day her mother came to watch her preside for the first time. She pinned her hair. She checked the mirror once, not for vanity but for composure, the way a surgeon checks their instruments before entering the room. Imagine being the deputies walking into that courtroom, expecting an ordinary Tuesday, expecting a judge they had never encountered, a proceeding that would run its course and return them to their lives. And instead, the door behind the bench opens, and the woman they pressed against the hood of a car at 3 a.m. is standing there in a robe and pearls because the video they made of their own actions is the reason she is there. Do you think moments like this actually move the needle, or is one case never enough to change a system? Drop justice in the comments if you believe accountability compounds, or one case if you think it takes more than this. And hit like if you're staying for what happens next. She drove to the Travis County Courthouse along the same route she had driven home 4 hours earlier. She passed exit 245. She passed the Shell station canopy, the fluorescent lights still on in the early morning gray, pump 5 sitting empty. She did not slow down. The courthouse lot was already crowded. News vehicles lined the far perimeter. A small group had gathered on the steps, not protesters exactly, but witnesses, people who had seen the footage and wanted to be present for whatever came next. The gallery inside was full. Deputies Harlan and Klein sat at the defense table in pressed uniforms, their posture carrying the particular confidence of men who have faced department inquiries before and emerged from them unchanged. Their attorney was arranging papers with the unhurried calm of someone who believes the morning is already decided. Ada entered through the door behind the bench. The bailiff called the room to order. The words moved through the air the way they always did in a courtroom, functional, formal, weight-bearing. All rise. The court is now in session. The Honorable Ada Campbell presiding. The moment Harlan looked up and saw her face, the color left his. Klein's pen stopped moving. Their attorney's calm did not survive the next 3 seconds. Ada set her notes on the bench, adjusted the angle of the microphone, and looked out at the room with the expression she had worn for 23 years in every courtroom she had ever entered, composed, precise, and entirely without performance. She called the case. The first thing Ada did when the room settled was put herself on the record. Not defensively, not apologetically. With the same clinical precision she had used at sentencing hearings, at suppression motions, at every proceeding where the facts required stating clearly regardless of who they made uncomfortable, she disclosed in full the events of the prior evening, the stop, the credentials, the arrest, the holding cell, the release. She noted the time of each. She cited the applicable recusal statute and the controlling circuit precedent. She explained, in terms that left no interpretive room, the distinction between a judge who has been personally wronged and a judge who cannot be fair, and why she was the former and not the latter. The defense motion to recuse was filed before she finished speaking. She denied it from the bench before the attorney had returned to his seat. Jury selection took the remainder of the morning. Ada conducted voir dire with the focused patience of someone who has learned that the foundation of a verdict is built in the questions asked before a single witness takes the stand. She was looking for something specific, not sympathy, not outrage, but the capacity to evaluate evidence without flinching from what it showed. She found 12 people who met that standard and seated them with quiet confidence. Opening statements followed in the early afternoon. The plaintiff's attorney was methodical and devastating in the way that only preparation can produce no flourish, no performance, simply the facts of Jamal Reed's night arranged in sequence until their weight became undeniable. The defense opened with the standard architecture: discretionary force, officer safety, split-second decisions, the impossibility of hindsight. It was competent. It landed on the room like rain on concrete, present, and then gone. Jamal Reed took the stand in the early afternoon. He was 19 years old and carried himself with the particular dignity of someone who has been required to defend his own existence in public and has decided not to be diminished by the requirement. He described the stop in a flat, careful voice, the lane violation he had not committed, the instruction to step out of the vehicle. The moment when the situation changed from a traffic stop into something else entirely. He described the gravel against the side of his face. He described the inability to breathe properly for 6 weeks after the fracture. He described the moment, 3 months after the dropped charges, when he realized the asymmetry in his face was not going to correct itself. He was on the stand for 40 minutes. The gallery did not move. Midway through the afternoon session, a man entered through the rear door of the courtroom and approached the bailiff with a USB drive in one hand and a handwritten note in the other. He was a cook at the Whataburger across the street from the Shell station at exit 245. He had been one of the people recording from the side entrance the previous night. He had gone home after his shift, reviewed his footage, realized what it showed, and driven to the courthouse. Ada reviewed the footage in a recess with both counsel present. The Ring doorbell camera mounted on the building across the street had a wider angle than any of the handheld recordings. It showed Harlan taking Ada's credentials, examining the federal court seal, handing them back. It showed him turning to Klein and laughing. It showed both men completing the arrest with the practiced efficiency of a routine stop. And it showed in the last 4 seconds before the cruiser pulled away Harlan and Klein standing beside the patrol vehicle in the orange light of the canopy, hands raised toward each other. A high five. The footage was admitted under Federal Rule 404B as pattern evidence of intentional conduct. Ada played it for the jury without comment. She did not need to comment. The room watched Harlan examine the credentials of a federal judge and laugh, and the room understood everything. Klein was called as an adverse witness the following morning. He lasted 40 minutes under cross-examination before the architecture of his account collapsed. He admitted, haltingly and then in full, that 11 seconds of body camera footage from Jamal Reed's arrest had been deleted. The forensic recovery of that footage, completed by a digital evidence unit 4 months prior and included in the plaintiff's exhibits, had already been introduced. The audio captured in those 11 seconds was now in evidence. It was unambiguous. He admitted the group chat, he admitted the name, the Central Texas Patrol Club, and the content of its messages, screenshots of which the plaintiff's attorney had been holding in reserve for this moment. The messages documented, in the deputy's own words, a practice of targeting black and Latino drivers on the Interstate 35 corridor north of Austin after dark, framed as a competition, tracked by count, celebrated with a vocabulary that required no interpretation. He named Harlan as the architect of the practice. Harlan took the stand the following afternoon against the explicit advice of his attorney. He held his composure for 20 minutes. Then the plaintiff's attorney, working from the group chat screenshots and the recovered audio, began to narrow the questions toward a specific statement Harlan had made in the chat 14 months earlier, a statement about who did and did not belong on that stretch of highway after dark. Harlan answered the question directly. The statement he made in the chat, he said, reflected his experience. Black drivers on Interstate 35 after dark, in his experience, were either coming from somewhere they should not have been or going somewhere they had no legitimate reason to go unless, he said, they had a reason he could verify. The courtroom was very quiet. Ada's expression did not change. What followed was the moment the trial had been building toward since the bailiff had called the room to order 2 days earlier. Ada stepped down from the bench. A senior judge, present by prior arrangement for exactly this contingency, took the chair. Ada walked to the witness stand and was sworn in under oath. She testified for 22 minutes. She described the previous night with the same precision she had used in her opening disclosure, but now from the witness chair, under oath, subject to cross-examination, as a private citizen rather than an officer of the court. She described Harlan examining her credentials. She described the laugh. She described the handcuffs. She described what she had said and what had been said in return. And she described something she had not mentioned in her opening disclosure, a suppression hearing 14 months earlier in which she had ruled against Harlan's testimony in a prior excessive force case, finding it not credible on the record. She had seen his name on the plaintiff's exhibit list before she ever took the bench in this proceeding. She had reviewed that prior hearing in the case file during the 90 minutes between Torres's call and her arrival at the courthouse. She had presided anyway, because the law required impartiality, not ignorance, and because Jamal Reed had not chosen any of this. She returned to the bench. She put the robe back on. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The verdict came back on every count in favor of Jamal Reed. $400,000 in compensatory damages, $13,500,000 in punitive damages, joint and several. Ada read the verdict into the record without inflection. Then she set down the paper. From the bench, she issued orders. Immediate suspension of both deputies pending departmental review. Creation of a civilian oversight board with subpoena power to be seated within 60 days. Mandatory body cameras for all patrol units in the county with a technical requirement preventing deactivation during active stops. An independent monitor with full access to department records for a period of 3 years. The removal of Harlan's training materials from the department's onboarding curriculum, effective immediately. She noted, for the record, that the jury's award constituted the largest civil rights verdict in the history of the state of Texas. She adjourned the court. She did not linger. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Ada drove to a cemetery on the eastern edge of Cedar Park. She parked at the end of the gravel path and walked to the grave in the faded law school sweatshirt, the same one she had been wearing at Pump 5, the same one she had worn in the holding cell, the same one she had been wearing when Torres called. The collar was still fraying. She had not replaced it. She stood at the headstone for a long time without speaking. The morning was cold and very clear. A bird moved through the bare branches of the live oak at the far end of the row. She said what she had come to say, quietly, without ceremony, in the voice she used only when no one else was listening. "We did it, Mama." On the last Friday of that month, Ada stopped for gas at exit 245 on her way back from the courthouse. Pump 5 was open. She pulled in. At the pump beside her, a black teenager fueled up a small hatchback with one hand on the nozzle and the other scrolling a phone, relaxed and unhurried. On the far side of the canopy, a Hispanic deputy in a county patrol vehicle pulled in, stepped out, nodded at the teenager without breaking stride, and slid his card into the reader. No flashlight, no bar of red and blue rotating in the dark. No one asked anyone to explain why they were there. Ada watched the numbers turn on the pump and said nothing. The lights above her were still the kind that made everything look like evidence. But what they were illuminating, this time, was different. The Constitution is not a suggestion, not anymore.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.
True justice is an evolving process, and awareness remains your strongest shield. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to clarity.